Charlotte Whitmore pressed her trembling hands flat against the wooden rail of the witness stand and forced herself to breathe. She would not cry. Not here. Not in front of them. The judge's gavel came down like a gunshot, and somewhere behind her she heard Margaret Harrington exhale. Slow, satisfied, the sound of a woman who had finally gotten exactly what she wanted. 6 years. Gone in a single morning. If you've ever been made to feel like you were nothing, stay with me. Subscribe. Follow this story to the very end and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far Charlotte's story travels. Richmond, Virginia. Summer, 1817. The courthouse on Broad Street had seen its share of misery. Debtors dragged before judges with hollow eyes. Men stripped of land their fathers had bled for. Widows clutching documents no one had ever explained to them. But on the morning of June the 14th, the misery had a different face. It had Charlotte Whitmore's face. She walked through those doors alone. No family flanking her. No lawyer standing at her elbow. No friend squeezing her hand in the hallway before she went in. Just herself, 27 years old, wearing a faded blue dress that had once been her Sunday best, and a composure that cost her more than anyone in that room would ever understand. She had rehearsed this. Standing in front of the cracked mirror in the boarding house on Church Street, she had told herself, "You will walk in straight. You will keep your chin level. You will not give them the satisfaction." She had practiced it so many times the words had started to feel hollow, but she held on to them anyway, because they were all she had. The courtroom was already full when she entered. Virginia society had a particular appetite for humiliation, especially when it belonged to someone who had never quite fit. Charlotte felt their eyes before she saw them. That prickling awareness on the back of her neck, the way the murmuring dipped and shifted when she pushed through the heavy oak doors. She recognized faces, neighbors from the Harrington circle. Women who had accepted her invitations to dinner and eaten her food and smiled at her across candlelit tables for 6 years. Not one of them smiled now. She moved to the plaintiff's side and sat down. The chair was hard beneath her. She kept her back straight. Nathaniel was already seated across the aisle. He was handsome in the way that certain Virginia men always were, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, the kind of face that portraits were generous to. He wore a new coat. She noticed that immediately. Dark green wool brass buttons. She had never seen it before. He had bought himself something new for the day he ended their marriage. She didn't know why that detail struck her so hard, of all the things to notice, but it did. He didn't look at her. Margaret Harrington sat beside her son with the posture of a woman presiding over a formal dinner rather than a divorce proceeding. 60 years of Virginia breeding had given her a particular kind of stillness, not peace, not grace, but control. Total, practiced, impenetrable control. She looked at Charlotte, and then very deliberately, she looked away. The judge, a heavy-set man named Alderton, with small spectacles and a reputation for brevity, shuffled his papers and cleared his throat. This proceeding concerns the dissolution of the marriage between Nathaniel James Harrington and Charlotte Ann Whitmore Harrington. He looked up over his spectacles. Mr. Harrington's counsel has submitted the petition. Mrs. Harrington, you have no legal representation present. No, sir, Charlotte said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Very well. He returned to his papers. Mr. Harrington's petition cites failure to fulfill the social obligations expected of a woman in her position and an inability to integrate appropriately into the Harrington family structure. He set the papers down. Mrs. Harrington, do you contest this characterization? Silence gathered in the room like heat. Charlotte pressed her palms flat against her knees beneath the table. You will not cry. I do contest it, she said. I managed the Harrington household for 6 years. I kept the accounts. I organized every gathering. Mrs. Harrington. The judge's voice was not unkind exactly, but it was final. The petition before me also notes that you have no family of standing, no property of your own, and no independent means. Is that correct? She felt the room lean in. Yes, she said quietly. That is correct. Then I'm afraid. Margaret Harrington rose from her seat. It was a perfectly timed interruption. Charlotte had no doubt it was rehearsed. "Your Honor," Margaret said, and her voice carried the effortless authority of a woman who had never once in her life been told to sit back down. "If I may." The judge gestured for her to continue. "My son married this woman in good faith despite the reservations of our family. Charlotte Whitmore came to us with no name, no connections, and no understanding of what it meant to carry a family like ours forward." She paused just long enough. "We attempted for 6 years to provide her with everything she lacked. We opened our home, our society, our name. And still she remained unsuited. We do not say this with cruelty. We say it with regret." The word regret landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Charlotte stared at the table in front of her. She thought about the winter 2 years ago, when Nathaniel had fallen ill with fever, and she had sat beside him for 4 nights without sleeping, changing cold compresses and reading to him from the Bible, because the sound of her voice seemed to ease him. She thought about the dinner party she had organized for 30 guests 3 weeks after losing her second pregnancy, when she had smiled and poured wine and thanked people for coming, and then gone upstairs afterward and sat on the floor of her dressing room until her legs stopped shaking. She thought about all the ways she had tried, all the ways she had made herself smaller so she would fit. And she looked up at Margaret Harrington standing there with her regret, and felt something crack open inside her chest. Not grief, not quite. Something older and quieter than grief. Something that had been waiting a very long time. Nathaniel's lawyer spoke for several more minutes. Charlotte did not hear much of it. She was focused on breathing. In, out, in, out. When it was her turn to speak again, she stood. "I would like the court to know," she said, "that I entered this marriage with every intention of honoring it. I worked. I cared for this family. I gave what I had to give." She looked at Nathaniel. He was looking at the window. "I did not fail this marriage," she said. "I was failed by it." A murmur moved through the crowd. The judge cleared his throat. "Be that as it may, Mrs. Harrington, the law in this matter is clear, without independent property or family standing to contest." "I understand," Charlotte said. She sat back down. The gavel came down shortly after. Marriage dissolved. No property settlement. No claim to the estate. No legal protection. The Harrington name, which she had carried and polished and protected for 6 years, was no longer hers. She was Charlotte Whitmore again. Just Charlotte Whitmore, daughter of no one that anyone remembered. She walked out of this courthouse into the summer heat. Virginia in June was relentless, the kind of heat that pressed down on everything, turned the air thick and slow, made even breathing feel like effort. The magnolias were blooming along the street, and their sweetness hung over everything, like something almost mournful. She stood on the steps and breathed it in. Behind her, she heard the courthouse doors open again. Margaret's voice. "Charlotte." She turned. Margaret descended the steps with that same controlled grace, a small leather travel bag in her gloved hand. She held it out. "Your personal belongings," Margaret said. "I had your room cleared this morning." Charlotte took the bag. It was lighter than she expected. 6 years of a life, and it weighed almost nothing. "I want you to understand," Margaret said, lowering her voice just enough that it felt almost like privacy, "that I bear you no personal ill will. You are simply not what this family required." Charlotte looked at her for a long moment. She thought about a dozen things she could say. Cutting things. True things. Things she had saved up without meaning to over 6 years of quiet endurance. She said none of them. "Good day, Mrs. Harrington," she said, and she walked away. She found a bench 3 blocks from the courthouse, under the shade of an old oak, and she sat down and opened the bag. A hairbrush, her mother's small silver thimble, a miniature portrait herself, and Nathaniel painted the first year of their marriage when his smile had still seemed like a promise. A Bible, its spine worn soft from her mother's hands, and beneath all of it, folded and sealed with wax long since dried and cracked, a letter. She recognized her mother's handwriting on the outside. For Charlotte, to be opened when the time is right. Her mother had pressed this into her hands on her wedding day. "Keep this safe, my love. Your father left it. She had never opened it. The mention of her father, a shadow figure absent, unreliable, a man her mother had spoken of rarely and always with a pain she refused to name, had made Charlotte want nothing to do with whatever he might have to say. She held the letter now and stared at it. Her father, Arthur Whitmore. She knew almost nothing about him. A merchant, her mother had said. A wanderer. A man who moved from place to place following ships and trade routes, and something inside himself he could never settle. He had been gone since Charlotte was 7 years old. He had sent money sometimes. Occasional letters that were brief and strange, full of descriptions of harbors and coastlines, and the weather over the Atlantic, as though he had forgotten his daughter was a child who might have wanted something more personal. He had died somewhere south of Baltimore 8 years ago. A fever, they said. A man alone on the road. Her mother had received word through a third party and had cried for 3 days without ever explaining why, since she had spent 12 years insisting she didn't care. Charlotte had not cried at all. You did not mourn someone who had never quite been present enough to lose. She turned the letter over in her hands. The summer heat pressed around her. Down the street the sounds of Richmond moved and breathed. Wagon wheels' voices, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. Life continuing indifferent as it always did. She broke the wax seal. Inside were 2 sheets of paper in her mother's hand. The third sheet tucked behind them was different older paper, different ink, and a handwriting she did not recognize. She read her mother's letter first. My darling Charlotte. If you are reading this, then something has gone wrong, and I am sorry for that. I am sorry I wasn't there to help you through it. I want you to know the truth about your father. I was not entirely honest with you, and I carried that lie because I thought it was kinder. It was not. Lies are never kinder in the long run, no matter how much we want to believe they are. Arthur Whitmore was not what I told you he was. I was not a wandering merchant with nothing to show for himself. He was a man who built something extraordinary and kept it hidden because he feared what wealth would do to the people around him. He feared it would change you. I wanted you to grow knowing how to be strong without it. I thought this was foolish. I was angry at him for it for many years. But he was not wrong about everything. The letter beneath this one is from his legal counsel. Read it carefully, Charlotte. All of it. He loved you. In his strange, insufficient, wandering way, he loved you. And he never stopped believing you were capable of far more than anyone around you could see. I hope you believe that too by the time this reaches you. All my love. Your mother. Charlotte's hands had gone still. She read the letter twice. Then she set it on her knee and picked up the third sheet. The legal document was formal and dense, written in the cautious language of lawyers who understood that words had consequences. She read it slowly. The name at the top was Arthur Whitmore. And then further down, words that began to rearrange everything she thought she understood. The entirety of the Whitmore Trading Company, including vessels, warehouses, land holdings along the Virginia and Maryland coastlines, and all associated investments and accounts to be held in trust for his daughter, Charlotte Ann Whitmore, until such time as she presents herself to the firm of Carter and Associates Baltimore to claim her rightful inheritance. She stopped reading. She read it again. Estimated value of the estate at the time of Arthur Whitmore's death, approximately $240,000. The paper shook in her hands. She looked up. The magnolias were still blooming. The heat was still pressing. Down the street a man was arguing with a cart driver about the price of something. 2 women walked past in summer bonnets, deep in conversation, paying no attention to the woman sitting on a bench with a letter that had just quietly rewritten her life. $240,000. She thought she had misread it. She read it again. She had not misread it. Charlotte sat on that bench for a very long time. She didn't know exactly how long. Long enough for the shadow of the oak to shift. Long enough for the sounds of the street to change lunch hour coming and going. The midday heat peaking and beginning very slowly to ease. She thought about Margaret Harrington's voice in the courtroom. She was never truly one of us. She thought about Nathaniel buying himself a new green coat for the morning he was going to dissolve her. She thought about 6 years. All the ways she had tried to be enough. All the ways she had been told in small and large gestures that she wasn't. And she thought about her father, a man she had resented for years, a man she had dismissed as someone who had simply chosen not to be present, and she tried to understand what he had been building all this time in the shadow of his absence. He had watched her mother said. He had known. He had believed she could do something with it. She folded the letters carefully and placed them back in the Bible. She closed the travel bag. She stood up. The summer sun hit her full in the face, bright and unforgiving and fierce, and she stood in it for a moment without flinching. There was a coach to Baltimore leaving from the inn on Main Street. She had enough coin for the fare. Everything else she would figure out when she got there. She arrived in Baltimore 2 days later, stiff from the road, and half convinced she had dreamed the whole thing. The offices of Carter and Associates occupied the ground floor of a solid brick building near the harbor. She could smell the water from the street salt and tar, and something vast and restless, the particular smell of a world that moved on water. She stood outside the door for a moment, straightened her dress, lifted her chin, went inside. The clerk at the front desk was a young man with ink-stained fingers and a distracted expression that shifted into surprise when she gave her name. "Charlotte Whitmore," he repeated. "Yes," she said. He stood up so fast he nearly knocked over his inkwell. "Please, one moment, please wait just a moment, Miss Whitmore." He disappeared through a door in the back. Charlotte stood in the entryway and looked around. Maps on the walls, ledgers stacked on shelves, a scale model of a three-masted ship on a shelf near the window. The door opened again, and a man came out 60 or so gray-haired, with the weathered look of someone who had spent a significant portion of his life outdoors. He walked with a slight limp, and he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. It took her a moment to recognize it. Relief. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was rough and warm at the same time. "My name is Samuel Carter. I've been your father's legal and business counsel for 23 years. He stopped a few feet in front of her and studied her face with an unself-conscious directness that she found she didn't mind. "You look like him," he said. "Around the eyes." Charlotte didn't know what to do with that. "I received his letter," she said carefully. "And my mother's. I confess I am still struggling to understand the full picture." "Of course you are." He gestured toward the back office. "Please, come sit down. There's a great deal I need to tell you, and some of it will be difficult to hear. But all of it is true, and all of it is yours." What Samuel Carter told her over the next 3 hours rearranged everything. Her father, Arthur Whitmore, had begun with almost nothing, a single small vessel, and enough recklessness to take it out against the advice of everyone who knew him. He had made his first significant profit at 23, his second at 26. By 30, he had built a trading network that stretched from the Carolinas to New England, with contacts in the West Indies and along the French coast. He had been very good at making money. He had been less good at staying in one place. "Your mother was the love of his life," Samuel said without any particular sentimentality, just as though it were a fact he was reporting. He knew that. He also knew he couldn't stop moving long enough to be the husband she deserved. He made choices that I believe he regretted for the rest of his life. He paused. He was not a simple man to know, but he was not a bad man. Charlotte thought about this. "He watched me," she said. "My mother said that." He kept correspondence with people in Richmond. He knew about the Harrington marriage. He knew... Samuel stopped. "He knew how they treated me." "Yes." "And he didn't..." She stopped herself, started again. He let it continue. Samuel looked at her steadily. "He believed you needed to find your own strength before you inherited his. He feared that wealth given too easily to a person who hadn't yet discovered themselves." He hesitated. His words were, "A fortune without a foundation is just a different kind of trap." He wanted the foundation to be yours before the fortune arrived. Charlotte was quiet for a moment. She thought about how angry she could be. How right it would be to feel that anger at her father, at his theory of her development. At the years she had spent, diminished while he watched from a distance, waiting for her to be ready. She felt the anger. She held it. Then she set it down. Because she was in Baltimore, and her father was dead, and there was a $240,000 trading empire that she had just inherited. "What do I need to do?" she said. Samuel Carter looked at her for a moment. Then he smiled. "That," he said, "is exactly what your father said you would ask." They spent the rest of the afternoon going through papers. There were ships, 5 of them, all active, running routes up and down the coast and into the Caribbean. There were warehouses in Baltimore, Norfolk, and Charleston. There were land holdings on the Virginia shore, prime coastal land that she hadn't known existed, sitting there patient and valuable, waiting. There were investments in 2 separate textile operations that were turning steady profits. And there was debt. Some of it, not catastrophic, but enough to require careful management. "Your father was building, always building," Samuel explained. "He was not a man who sat on money. He used it. Sometimes he used more than was strictly wise. But his instincts were almost always right eventually. And the people who work for him, for the company, they continue their work. They've been informed that the estate is in the process of settlement. Most of them have been with the company long enough that they understand these things take time. They'll need to be told," Charlotte said. "Directly, not through letters." She paused. "When can I meet them?" Samuel looked at her with that relieved expression again. "I can arrange introductions next week," he said. "If you're certain you want to move forward yourself." "My father's condition was that I take direct control," she said. "I intend to honor it." "Yes," Samuel said slowly. He thought you might say something like that too. She stayed in Baltimore. She found a respectable boarding house near the harbor run by a widow named Mrs. Parrish, who asked no questions and provided excellent coffee every morning, and she began the work of understanding what she had inherited. It was not simple. She had managed a household. She knew accounts, inventory, the management of servants, the logistics of social obligations. These things were not nothing, they required real skill, but a trading company was different in scale and complexity. She made mistakes. In the first month, she misread a contract and nearly committed the company to a shipping fee that would have been ruinous. Samuel caught it. He did not make her feel foolish about it. He simply explained carefully what she had missed and what to look for next time. She did not miss it again. She was relentless. She woke early and read ledgers before breakfast. She walked the docks and introduced herself to the captains and the loading crews, who looked at her with a mix of confusion and wariness that she recognized and did not take personally. She asked questions, dozens of questions constantly, about everything she didn't understand, and she listened to the answers with the kind of attention that people noticed. By the end of the second month, the first captain, a weathered man named Josiah Hale, who had sailed for her father for 15 years, stopped looking at her like she was a pleasant inconvenience and started talking to her like a business partner. That was the moment she knew she was going to be all right. She also, in those months, thought about Nathaniel. Not with the longing she might have expected. Not with the grief she had been bracing herself for. With something more complex, a slow, gradual process of understanding what had actually happened. She had loved Nathaniel once. She still believed that. The young man she had married, earnest, occasionally kind, capable of moments of real warmth, had been someone she had genuinely cared for. But she had spent 6 years loving a man who had never quite chosen her. He had chosen his mother, his name, his family's approval. He had chosen what was easier. She didn't hate him for it. She pitied him a little, and she thought about the woman she had been on the courthouse steps, holding a bag that weighed almost nothing. Refusing to cry, with 6 years of her life reduced to a handful of personal items and a letter she hadn't yet read, and she felt something she hadn't expected. She felt grateful, not for the pain, but for what came after it. One evening in October, sitting at the small desk in her room at Mrs. Parrish's boarding house with the harbor light going gold through the window and a stack of shipping contracts waiting for her review, Charlotte took out the miniature portrait from her travel bag. Herself and Nathaniel. She looked at it for a long time. Then she opened the drawer of the desk and placed it inside. She closed the drawer. She picked up the first contract and began to read. In Richmond, rumors had begun to circulate. Word traveled as it always did in Virginia society, slowly at first, then all at once. Someone who knew a clerk at Carter and Associates. The name Whitmore had surfaced in connection with a Baltimore trading firm of unexpected size. A woman, Nathaniel Harrington's discarded wife. Margaret Harrington heard the rumors and dismissed them. Impossible, she said over tea to the friend who brought her the gossip. The girl had nothing. She was nothing. But the rumors did not stop. They grew. Nathaniel heard them too. He was in his study one evening in November when his friend Thomas Beaumont came by unannounced with the particular energy of a man carrying news he couldn't wait to share. "You've heard about Charlotte," Thomas said before he was even fully seated. "I've heard various things," Nathaniel said carefully. "The Whitmore Trading Company, Nathaniel, Carter and Associates, Baltimore. 5 ships warehouse holdings in 3 cities. The woman is sitting on a fortune." Thomas shook his head. "I don't know exactly how much, but the numbers people are throwing around." He whistled low. "Your former wife, my friend, is not the woman we all thought she was." Nathaniel stared at the fire for a very long time after Thomas left. He thought about the morning at the courthouse, the faded blue dress, the way she had walked out without looking back. He thought about what he had said to her the last conversation they'd had, alone a week before the divorce proceedings, when he had stood in the doorway of her room and told her with the measured cruelty of a man who had convinced himself it was honesty. "You've never truly belonged here, Charlotte. I think somewhere inside you, you've always known that." She had looked at him. She had not argued. She had not cried. She had said very quietly, "I wonder if you will remember saying that." He had not understood what she meant. He was beginning to understand now. Charlotte in Baltimore did not know about any of this. She was too busy. She had discovered a problem with the Norfolk warehouse operation, a manager who had been skimming profits in small, careful increments for long enough that it had become a significant sum. She handled it directly, rode to Norfolk herself, met with the man, confronted him with the evidence, gave him the opportunity to make it right, and when he attempted to bluster and deflect, she terminated his employment and handed the matter to Samuel's legal contacts without raising her voice once. Word moved through the company quickly after that. Miss Whitmore was not a figurehead. Miss Whitmore was paying attention. Winter settled over the coast. Charlotte stood on the Baltimore docks one gray December morning and watched one of her father's ships. Her ship. She was still learning to think of it that way, come in from a Carolina run. The crew moved efficiently in the cold, offloading cargo, calling to each other with the easy rhythm of men who knew their work. Captain Hale appeared at her elbow. "Good run," he said. "Decent profit on the timber." "I know. I reviewed the preliminary numbers this morning." She paused. "The cargo manifest shows we ran light on the return trip. Was there no opportunity to take on freight at the Charleston stop?" Hale glanced at her sideways. "There was a possibility, but the rates were below what your father typically accepted." "What were the rates?" he told her. She did the calculation in her head. "Even at those rates, an empty hold costs more than a partial load," she said. "Next run, take it." Howe was quiet for a moment. "Your father would have argued about principle," he said. "My father didn't need to maximize every run," she said. "I'm still building." Hale was quiet for another moment. Then he nodded once, the particular nod of a man revising his opinion of someone. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She was learning. Every day she was learning. And somewhere beneath the ledgers and the contracts and the dock negotiations and the cold Baltimore mornings, something was happening to Charlotte Whitmore that she hadn't expected. She was discovering that she liked this. Not just the power of it, not just the security, but the work itself, the puzzle of it, the way every decision connected to every other decision, the way understanding came in slow increments and then suddenly all at once. She had spent 6 years being told she was unsuited. She had spent 6 years making herself smaller to fit. And now she was in a building near a harbor that smelled like salt and possibility, reading her father's ledgers by lamplight, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt exactly suited, exactly right, like the woman she had always been supposed to become. Spring came, and with it, word arrived from Richmond. The Harrington family's finances, which had never been as solid as their reputation suggested, were showing significant strain. The tobacco market had shifted. A bad investment, badly timed. Nathaniel's father had died the previous winter, leaving behind debts that had been quietly managed for years but could no longer be concealed. There were parties' creditors, whispers at every dinner table, and the Virginia social season was approaching, the most important gathering of the year, where status was displayed and alliances were cemented, and the business of society was conducted under the guise of pleasure. Charlotte received the information from Samuel, who had contacts everywhere. She read his letter twice. She thought about what Margaret had said on the courthouse steps. "You are simply not what this family required." She set the letter down. She looked out the window at the harbor. The ships were out there, her ships moving up and down the coast, loading and unloading, building and building and building. She thought about the woman on the courthouse steps, holding a bag that weighed nothing, refusing to cry. She thought about what her father had written in the letter that had been passed through Samuel's hands. Words she had read so many times now, she could recite them without looking. "I built this for you because I believed you were always more than what the world let you be. Come prove me right." She folded Samuel's letter carefully. She stood up. "Samuel," she said aloud, to the empty room, to the harbor, to no one, and to everything. "I believe it's time I returned to Virginia." The road back to Virginia was long, and Charlotte had made herself a promise before she left Baltimore. She would not rush. She would not arrive half-ready, half-certain, half-formed. If she was going back, she was going back completely. So she spent 3 more weeks in Baltimore first. 3 weeks that felt different from all the weeks before them, tighter, more purposeful, the way the air changes right before a storm breaks. She met with every captain personally. She reviewed every outstanding contract. She sat with Samuel Carter for 2 full days, going through the legal structure of the Whitmore estate, until she understood it well enough to explain it to someone else. "You're nervous," Samuel said at the end of the second day. "I'm prepared," Charlotte said. "Those aren't the same thing." She looked at him across the desk. "No," she said. "They're not." He studied her for a moment. "Your father was nervous too the first time he walked into a room that he knew was going to change his life. He told me once it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff in the dark. You knew something was out there, you just couldn't see how far the drop was." "What did he do?" "He stepped off anyway." Samuel paused. "And he flew." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up the last contract on the desk and signed her name to the bottom of it. Charlotte Ann Whitmore, clear and deliberate, and set it down. "Send word to the Richmond contacts," she said. "I'd like a full picture of the Harrington financial situation before I arrive. Not rumors, facts. I'll have it to you within a week." "Good." She rose from the chair and straightened her dress. "I leave on the 14th. The facts arrived on the 12th. She read the report at the small desk in her room at Mrs. Parrish's boarding house, with the morning light coming in off the harbor, and a cup of coffee going cold beside her, because she kept forgetting to drink it. The Harrington situation was worse than the rumors had suggested. Nathaniel's father, Edwin Harrington patriarch, and the quiet financial engine of the family, had died in January, leaving behind a web of obligations that even Samuel's contact described as an impressively complicated disaster. A failed land investment in the Western Territories. A promissory note to a Charleston bank that had been rolled over 3 times. 2 crop seasons of below-expected tobacco yields on the primary Harrington plantation. And something else. Something that made Charlotte set down her coffee cup very carefully. Nathaniel had borrowed against the Richmond property, the house where she had lived for 6 years. The house Margaret had made absolutely clear was the crown jewel of the Harrington legacy. It was serving as collateral against a debt that, if not addressed by the following autumn, would pass to lien. Margaret Harrington did not know. The note at the bottom of Samuel's report read, "The matriarch appears to have been kept uninformed of the full scope of obligations. This is a significant vulnerability." Charlotte folded the report. She thought about Margaret standing on the courthouse steps. "You are simply not what this family required." She thought about Nathaniel, his new green coat, his eyes finding the window instead of her face. And then she thought about something her father had written in one of the older letters she'd found buried in the estate files, not directed to her, but to Samuel years ago, about a business rival who had treated him poorly when he was young and unknown. "I could destroy him," Arthur Whitmore had written. "I have every legal right. But destroying a man only proves you're stronger than him. I'm not interested in proving that. I'm interested in building something worth more than the satisfaction." She read that line 3 times. Then she packed her bags. She arrived in Richmond on a Tuesday afternoon in late April, when the dogwoods were finishing and the azaleas were burning red and pink along every respectable fence line in the city. She had arranged rooms at the Fairfax Inn on Grace Street, comfortable but not ostentatious, which was deliberate. She was not ready to be noticed. Not yet. The first person she called on was not Samuel's local contact. It was a woman named Delia Marsh. Delia was 62 years old, a widow and the most reliable source of information in Richmond society, not because she gossiped, but because she had spent 40 years paying careful attention to what other people dismissed as unimportant. She and Charlotte's mother had been friends once long ago, and Delia had shown Charlotte quiet kindnesses during the Harrington years that Charlotte had not forgotten. She found Delia in the garden of her house on Franklin Street, cutting back the spent spring roses with a pair of long shears, and when Charlotte opened the gate, Delia looked up and went absolutely still. "Charlotte Whitmore," she said slowly, like she was verifying a fact. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Marsh." Delia set down the shears and pulled off her gardening gloves and came across the yard with the swift, purposeful movement of a woman who had learned not to waste time. She took both of Charlotte's hands in hers and looked at her face for a long moment. "You look different," Delia said. "I feel different." "Different how?" Charlotte thought about the docks in Baltimore, the ledger columns at midnight, Captain Hale's slow nod, the contracts in her own handwriting. "Like myself," she said, "for the first time in a very long time." Delia's eyes went sharp and warm at the same time. She squeezed Charlotte's hands once hard and then said, "Come inside. I'll put the kettle on, and you can tell me what in the world you've been doing, because the things people are saying don't begin to account for the look on your face." They sat in Delia's parlor for 2 hours. Charlotte did not tell her everything. She told her enough: the inheritance, the Baltimore operation, the months of learning the decision to return. Delia listened with the complete focused attention of someone who understood that what was being shared mattered, and when Charlotte finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Margaret Harrington is going to have a complete fit," Delia said finally. "I expect so. Nathaniel is not doing well. I don't know if you've heard. I have some information, not all of it." Delia leaned forward slightly. "It's the debts, Charlotte. He doesn't talk about them, of course, but anyone who looks at the family closely enough can see the cracks. They're hosting the summer gathering, the Harrington Estate, June, and everyone believes it's because they want to maintain appearances. But the people who know better are saying it's because they desperately need to make connections before the situation becomes public." Charlotte set her teacup down very carefully. "The summer gathering," she repeated. "Always the most important event of the Richmond season. You know that better than anyone. You organized 3 of them." Charlotte did know. She had organized 3 of those gatherings. She had managed the invitations, the menus, the flower arrangements, the seating, the music. She had done it meticulously, invisibly, in the way that the Harrington household expected all her contributions to be present, but uncredited, essential, but unacknowledged. She looked at Delia. "When were invitations sent?" she asked. 2 weeks ago." "And the date?" "June the 19th. June the 19th. 7 weeks away." "Mrs. Marsh," Charlotte said, "would you consider accompanying me to a small social call this week?" Delia looked at her with an expression that mixed amusement and something very close to delight. "Where are we calling?" "I need to meet with the Richmond branch of Carter and Associates. And then I'd like to call on Judge Alderton." The amusement sharpened into pure delight. "Judge Alderton, the man who dissolved your marriage." "The very one." Charlotte picked up her teacup again, calm as a morning in May. "He sits on the board of the Richmond Commercial Society, and I understand the society is currently looking for investors in their new harbor infrastructure project." Delia stared at her for a full 3 seconds. Then she laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere genuine. "My Lord Charlotte Whitmore, your father would be proud." The meeting with Judge Alderton was on a Thursday. Charlotte wore her best dress, deep blue, well-cut, the kind of garment that said, "I have resources," without saying it in words. She was composed and direct and knew her numbers, and she watched the judge's face move through surprise recalibration, and then a rather transparent attempt to recover his usual authority, all within the space of about 4 minutes. I was not a cruel man. She had understood that even in the courtroom. He had simply been a man operating within the system available to him, and the system had not been built with Charlotte's interests in mind. "I understand the society is seeking investment partners for the harbor project," she said. "We are in early discussions, yes." He was careful, measured. "I'd like to be included in those discussions." She set a one-page summary of the Whitmore Trading Company on his desk, prepared by Samuel, reviewed 3 times by Charlotte, precise and clear. "As you can see, our coastal operations give us particular interest in harbor infrastructure." He read it. She watched him read it. She watched the moment when the numbers fully registered. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and then seemed uncertain what to say next. "You presided over my divorce hearing," she said gently. "I understand that may make this unusual, but I think we can agree that business and personal history are separate matters." He looked at her for a moment. "You've changed considerably since last summer," he said. "I haven't actually," she said. "I've simply become more visible." He was quiet for another moment. Then he extended his hand across the desk. "I'll arrange for you to be included in the next society meeting," he said. 2 weeks from Monday." She shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, Judge Alderton." Word began to move through Richmond, the way it always did, in fragments, in hallway conversations, in the particular silence that followed a name being dropped into a room. Charlotte Whitmore was back. Charlotte Whitmore had money. Charlotte Whitmore had, and this was the part that no one could quite make sense of, a trading company. The confusion was almost funny. Charlotte heard about it secondhand through Delia, who had her finger on the pulse of Richmond society with the precision of a physician monitoring a difficult patient. People simply could not reconcile the woman from the courtroom, the quietly diminished wife in the faded dress, with what they were hearing. Margaret Harrington, by all accounts, dismissed it entirely. Gossip. Margaret was reported to have said at a gathering Charlotte had not been invited to, "That woman never had any real substance. Whatever she's claiming, I assure you, it won't amount to anything." Nathaniel said nothing publicly, but Delia had it on good authority that he had written Charlotte a letter. The letter arrived at the Fairfax Inn on a Thursday morning in early May, and Charlotte sat with it for almost 10 minutes before opening it. She recognized his handwriting immediately. "Charlotte, I have heard things, perhaps you have intended me to hear them, that suggest your situation has changed significantly since last summer. I write not to pry, but to say that I hope, whatever the truth of it, that you are well. I also want to say, though I understand if you have no interest in reading further, that I have thought often about the courthouse, about what I said to you in the weeks before. I behaved poorly. I allowed my mother's opinion to become my own in ways I am not proud of. I do not write to ask anything of you. I write only because a man with any character at all should not leave those words standing unremarked. N.H." She read it twice. Then she set it in the drawer of the desk on top of the miniature portrait she had placed there months ago in Baltimore. She did not reply. Not because she was punishing him. She had thought about this carefully, and she understood the difference. Cruelty withholds a response to inflict pain. She withheld a response because she had nothing she needed to say, and because the part of her that had waited for his acknowledgement for 6 years had quietly, somewhere over the winter, stopped waiting. That was not triumph. It was just done. She spent the first weeks in Richmond doing exactly what she had done in Baltimore, working. She met with the Carter and Associates local partners. She walked the commercial district and identified where Whitmore Holdings intersected with Richmond business. She had 2 long conversations with a city councilman about road infrastructure that would affect shipping routes she cared about. She was building relationships the same way her father had built them, methodically, genuinely, with real attention and real interest. Not performing connection, but making it. People noticed. One morning she was coming out of the Carter offices on Main Street when she nearly walked into Thomas Beaumont, Nathaniel's friend, the man who had delivered the gossip about her fortune to the Harrington study the previous winter. He stopped dead on the pavement and stared at her with the expression of a man confronted by something his brain had not yet caught up with. "Miss Whitmore," he managed. "Mr. Beaumont." She stopped politely. "How do you do?" "I very well, thank you." He recovered himself partly. "I had heard you were in Richmond." "For several weeks now, yes." He looked at her the way men looked at her these days, recalibrating, revising, trying to reconcile the image they'd held with the reality in front of them. "You're well?" he asked. "Extremely," she said pleasantly. "That's—" He shook his head slightly. "That's wonderful, truly." "Give my regards to your family," she said, and walked on. She didn't look back. She was past the point of needing to. It was Delia who told her about the Harrington debt crisis escalating. The middle of May. They were having lunch at Delia's house, a habit they had established Tuesdays and Fridays, and Delia set down her fork with the careful deliberateness of someone about to say something that mattered. "The Charleston note," Delia said. "It's been called." Charlotte looked up. "Nathaniel received formal notice 3 days ago. The bank wants payment by September, or they move on the collateral." Delia met her eyes. "The Richmond house, Charlotte. Margaret still doesn't know." Charlotte put down her own fork. She thought about the Richmond house. The hallways she had walked for 6 years. The kitchen, where she had learned which cook needed to be handled gently and which needed direct instruction. The garden she had planted roses in that first spring, because it had nothing growing in it, and emptiness bothered her. She did not feel satisfaction. She felt unexpectedly something more complicated than that. "How much is the note?" she asked. Delia told her. Charlotte did the calculation. "It's manageable," she said slowly, "for the right buyer." Delia stared at her. "Charlotte." "I'm not going to buy their debt," Charlotte said. "That's not what I mean. I'm saying it's a manageable sum. That they could find a solution if they looked for one, instead of spending the summer gathering trying to impress their way out of a financial crisis. They don't know how to solve it," Delia said. "Nathaniel has never had to solve anything without his father behind him. And Margaret—" She paused. "Margaret believes dignity is its own resource. She genuinely thinks if they host the gathering beautifully enough, people will extend them credit simply out of respect." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "There's something I need to ask you," she said carefully. "And I want you to answer honestly, not kindly. When have I ever been kind at the expense of honest?" Charlotte almost smiled. "Was Nathaniel, is he a bad man, or is he a weak one?" Delia considered this for longer than Charlotte expected. "Weak," she said finally. "Without question weak. He has never wanted to be cruel. He simply has never had the spine to resist the people who were." She paused. "His mother is a different matter. Margaret chose her cruelty consciously. She built it into policy. And the people who work on the Harrington estate, the house staff, the farm workers. They've been with the family for years, some of them for decades. If the estate collapses—" Delia stopped. "They lose everything," Charlotte finished. "Yes." Charlotte picked up her fork again and ate for a few minutes in silence. "I'm going to the summer gathering," she said. "You haven't been invited." "No." She looked at Delia calmly. "I'm going to be." The invitation came through the most unlikely channel, Judge Alderton. Charlotte had built enough of a relationship with the commercial society in her weeks of careful attendance at their meetings that Alderton had begun to regard her with the specific warmth of a man who understood. He had initially misjudged someone and was compensating by being especially helpful. When she mentioned delicately that she understood the Harrington gathering was the social event of the summer, and that she had some interest in reconnecting with Virginia society. After her months away, he had offered without being asked to speak to Nathaniel directly. She had not anticipated that. She had expected to work harder for it. But she accepted the outcome without showing her surprise because she had learned that revealing how much a thing matters to you before you've secured it is a form of vulnerability you simply cannot afford. The invitation arrived on a Saturday morning. Cream-colored paper, the Harrington seal, written in the handwriting of a clerk not Margaret or Nathaniel, which meant it had been sent formally at someone else's request, and no one in the household was entirely sure how to feel about it. She set it on the desk beside the other papers. She sat with it for a while. She thought about the June morning almost a year ago when she had stood in this same posture at a different desk in a different room and held a letter that had rearranged her life. She thought about the woman who had been sitting on that bench outside the courthouse with a bag that weighed nothing in a faded blue dress, pressing her hands together to keep them from shaking. She thought about what her father had written. She was valuable before anyone recognized it. She picked up her pen. She wrote her acceptance. 2 days before the gathering, a young woman appeared at the Fairfax Inn asking for Miss Whitmore. Charlotte came down to the sitting room to find a girl of perhaps 19 plainly dressed, holding her hat in both hands, with the posture of someone who had talked themselves into coming here and was now terrified they'd made a terrible mistake. "Miss Whitmore," the girl said. "Yes, my name is Lucy Garrett. She swallowed. "I work at the Harrington house. I have a message. From Mr. Harrington." Charlotte studied the girl for a moment. "Sit down, Miss Garrett. Would you like tea?" The girl blinked as though the offer confused her. Yes, please, thank you." They sat. The girl. Lucy twisted her hat in her hands for a moment, gathering herself, and then said, "Mr. Harrington asked me to come because he didn't want to put this in writing. He said to tell you that his mother doesn't know you'll be at the gathering. He thought you should know." Charlotte was quiet. "He also said—" Lucy stopped, swallowed again. "He said to tell you that he understands if you intend to make things difficult for the family. He said he'd deserve it." Charlotte looked at the girl carefully. There was something in her face, some tension that went beyond nervousness about delivering a message. "How long have you worked for the Harrington household, Miss Garrett?" she asked. 3 years, ma'am." "And in those 3 years have you been treated fairly?" The girl's hands tightened on her hat. A tiny movement, but Charlotte saw it. "The work is steady," Lucy said carefully. "The wages are usually on time. Usually." Charlotte filed that away. "Tell Mr. Harrington," she said slowly, "that I am not coming to the gathering to make things difficult. I am coming because I was invited." She paused. "And tell him that whatever happens, the people of the Harrington household who have worked faithfully will not be harmed by anything I do. That is a promise." Lucy stared at her. "You mean that?" the girl said, and there was something raw in her voice, the sound of someone who had stopped expecting promises from people who held power. "I mean everything I say," Charlotte said simply. The girl left 20 minutes later, and Charlotte sat alone in the sitting room with her tea going cold, thinking about Lucy Garrett's hands twisting that hat, and the word usually, and all the invisible people in invisible rooms who bore the consequences of the decisions made by people like Nathaniel and Margaret Harrington. She thought about what her father had built. She thought about what she intended to build. She thought about June the 19th. 7 days away. She spent the week before the gathering quietly. No social calls. No visits to the commercial society. She let the Richmond rumor mill work without her, which it did with considerable enthusiasm. She heard through Delia that Margaret had discovered Charlotte would be attending Delia, wasn't sure exactly how the information had reached her, though she suspected Thomas Beaumont and had gone to Nathaniel in fury, demanding he rescind the invitation, and Charlotte asked at their Tuesday lunch. "He didn't," Delia said with the expression of someone still slightly surprised. "I don't know what he said to her, but he held his ground." She apparently retired to her room for the rest of the day. Charlotte processed this. "That's new," she said. "Very," Delia agreed. "I think finding out about the extent of the debt may have shifted something. When a man realizes he's been protecting an illusion, and the illusion has a price tag on it." She shrugged. "Sometimes it clarifies things." Charlotte thought about Nathaniel's letter. "I allowed my mother's opinion to become my own in ways I am not proud of." She had read it again last week, late at night when she was having trouble sleeping. She still had nothing to say to him, but she had stopped being angry while she read it, which felt like its own kind of progress. She arrived at the gathering in a carriage. Not a grand entrance, she had debated this carefully, and decided against anything that felt theatrical. The Whitmore Trading Company's resources were real. She did not need to perform them. She wore a gown in deep ivory, simply cut with a brooch at the collar that had been her mother's. Her hair was dressed plainly. She carried no fan, no affectations, nothing that wasn't exactly what she needed. She stepped out of the carriage and stood for a moment in the warm June evening, looking at the Harrington house. She had walked through that front door hundreds of times. She had never once walked through it as herself. The gathering was already full when she entered. The season's most important event, 60, perhaps 70 guests. Filling the main room's voices layered over the music of two violinists in the corner. Candles everywhere. The particular golden warmth of a Virginia summer evening coming through the tall windows. She walked in, and the room changed. She felt it before she saw it. That quality of attention shifting, like iron filings moving toward a magnet, slow, and then all at once. Conversations didn't stop entirely, but they altered. Voices dropped. Eyes moved. She moved through the room with the ease of someone who had learned over a long winter in Baltimore that authority is not performed but inhabited. 3 people spoke to her within the first 5 minutes. 2 of them she had met through the commercial society. The third was a woman she recognized from Nathaniel's social circle, who had sat in the courtroom last June and never once looked her way, who was now smiling at her with the polished warmth of someone who has decided quickly and efficiently that this is a person worth knowing. Charlotte was pleasant. She was measured. She did not say anything sharp or revealing or designed to wound. She was simply completely herself. She was across the room, deep in conversation with Judge Alderton and another society member about the harbor project when she heard the silence fall behind her. The particular silence of a room when someone enters it unexpectedly. She turned. Margaret Harrington was standing in the doorway of the main parlor. She was dressed immaculately. She had always been an impressive woman in her presentation. There was no denying that. But her face, when she found Charlotte across the room, did something that Charlotte had never once in 6 years seen it do. It went uncertain, just for a moment, one unguarded second, where Margaret Harrington looked at the woman standing in her parlor, the woman she had handed a bag of belongings and dismissed on courthouse steps. The woman she had called a burden and unsuited and not one of us, and something behind those composed eyes flickered. Charlotte held her gaze. She did not smile. She did not look away. She simply looked back, steady and clear and unafraid. Margaret recovered herself within moments. Of course she did. She was Margaret Harrington, and composure was her primary skill. She turned to the guest nearest her and said something gracious and moved into the room. But Charlotte had seen it. That one unguarded second. And she understood with a clarity that felt almost peaceful what it meant. It meant Margaret had never truly believed her own verdict. Somewhere beneath all that practiced certainty, beneath the courthouse pronouncements and the courthouse steps and the 6 years of treatment that said you are less than us, she had always known. The woman she had discarded was not worthless. She had simply been unseen, and she was not unseen anymore. Nathaniel found her near the windows an hour into the evening. She had half expected him to avoid her entirely. She had also half expected the opposite, that the occasion would force a conversation. Neither of them had quite been ready to have through letters and second-hand messages. He looked tired, not the tiredness of one difficult evening, but something deeper, the accumulated fatigue of a man who had been managing a problem larger than himself for months without adequate resources because he had never had to develop them. "Charlotte," he said. "Nathaniel." He stood beside her at the window, and they both looked out at the garden for a moment, which was an old habit. They had stood like this at countless gatherings in the early years, when things were easier between them. "You look well," he said finally. "I am well. I heard about the Baltimore operation. More than heard at this point, it's all anyone in the commercial society talks about." He paused. "I don't say this to flatter you. I say it because you deserve to hear it plainly. You've built something impressive. My father built most of it, she said. I'm learning to run it. There's no small thing in that, he said. She looked at him then. How are you, Nathaniel, genuinely? I was quiet for a moment. I'm in trouble, he said, simply without self-pity, and she thought that was probably the most honest thing she'd ever heard him say. The family is in trouble. I've made choices that I didn't understand were choices at the time, which I suppose is the most embarrassing kind of mistake. The Charleston note, she said. His expression shifted. You know about that. I know about most things now. I've made it a priority to. She paused. I'm not going to help you with it, Nathaniel. I'm not asking you to. But I want you to know that I am not going to use it against you either. She turned back to the window. There are people in your household who have worked faithfully for years. I made a promise about them, and I keep my promises. He was silent for a long moment. You were always better than this family deserved, he said quietly. Yes, Charlotte said. Not with cruelty, not with triumph, just as the plain fact it had always been. I was. He flinched. Not with anger, with recognition. She left him at the window and moved back into the room, into the candlelight and the voices and the warm Virginia evening, carrying herself the way she had practiced, steady, present, unashamed, and she felt it then fully for the first time. Not the power of the money, not the satisfaction of the reversal, but something quieter and more permanent than either. She was Charlotte Whitmore. She had always been Charlotte Whitmore. The world had simply taken a very long time to catch up to the fact. She left the Harrington gathering before 10 o'clock. Not because she was finished, but because she understood with the instinct she had been sharpening all winter that the moment you have made your point is precisely the moment to stop making it. She said her goodbyes to Judge Alderton and the 2 society members she had been speaking with. She thanked the host, a formality that cost her nothing, and communicated everything. She moved through the room without hurry, without theater, and she walked out the front door of the Harrington house into the warm June night with the same composure she had walked in with. It was different now. She knew it, and everyone inside that room knew it, even the ones who hadn't fully understood yet what they were feeling. Delia was waiting for her in the carriage. Charlotte climbed in and sat down and did not say anything for a long moment. The horses moved and the wheels turned, and Richmond moved past the windows in the particular darkness of a summer night. And Delia watched her with the quiet patience of a woman who had learned that some things needed a moment before they could be spoken. Well, Delia said finally. Charlotte let out a breath, long and slow. Margaret saw me, she said, across the room, before she could compose herself. And she was afraid. Charlotte turned to look at Delia directly. Not of me exactly, of what I represent, of the fact that she was wrong, and the world now knows it, and she cannot undo it. Delia was quiet for a moment. How did that feel? She asked carefully. Charlotte thought about it honestly. Smaller than I expected, she said, and larger at the same time, in different ways. She was back at the Fairfax Inn by 10:30. She sat at her desk and opened the estate ledger she kept for her personal review, separate from the official company books. This was the one she maintained herself by hand every evening, tracking the decisions she'd made and the reasoning behind them. Her father had kept ledgers like this, Samuel had told her. Not just numbers, but notes, observations, questions. She found it clarifying. She wrote for a while. Not about the gathering, not yet. She wrote about the conversation with Nathaniel at the window, trying to understand exactly what had changed in him, and whether it was real or circumstantial. She had spent 6 years learning to read that man, and her honest assessment was this. He was not performing remorse to gain something from her. He was genuinely, for perhaps the first time, sitting with the weight of his own choices without his mother between him and the consequences. Whether that would last, that was another question entirely. She closed the ledger. Then she opened the drawer and looked at the miniature portrait one more time. She and Nathaniel. Year 1. His smile that had seemed like a promise. She took the portrait out, turned it over, and placed it face down in the drawer. Then she closed it again. Done. 3 days after the gathering, Margaret Harrington came to call. Charlotte was in the middle of reviewing a shipping contract when the Fairfax Inn's proprietor knocked on her door with the expression of a man who had just been surprised by something. "A Mrs. Harrington, ma'am. She's downstairs, asking for you." Charlotte set her pen down. She took a moment. Not to compose herself, she was already composed, but to understand what this meant. Margaret Harrington did not call on people. People called on Margaret Harrington. The fact that she was standing in the lobby of the Fairfax Inn without an appointment in the middle of a Wednesday morning told Charlotte more than anything Margaret was likely to say. "Please show her to the sitting room," Charlotte said. "Tell her I'll be down in 10 minutes." She was down in 8. Margaret was seated when Charlotte entered, very straight, very still, her hands folded in her lap with the particular rigid elegance of a woman exercising maximum self-control. She was dressed beautifully as always, but there was something around her eyes that Charlotte had never seen before. She looked older, not in years, in something less forgiving than years. "Mrs. Harrington," Charlotte said pleasantly. "This is a surprise. Sit down, Charlotte." The old authority. Automatic, reflexive. Charlotte paused. Then she sat, not because she was told to, but because she chose to, and she made sure the distinction was visible in the unhurried way she did it. Margaret watched her. "You did not have to come to that gathering," Margaret said. "I was invited." "You know what I mean." Charlotte looked at her steadily. "Then say what you mean." A muscle moved in Margaret's jaw. She was not accustomed to being asked to be plain. She had spent 60 years communicating in the elaborate, indirect language of Virginia society, where what you said and what you meant were rarely the same thing. But she was here, which meant something had broken through. "I want to understand your intentions," Margaret said. "Toward the family, toward Nathaniel." "My intentions," Charlotte said carefully, "are to conduct my business affairs and to live my life. I have no designs on the Harrington family." That is not entirely reassuring. "With respect, Mrs. Harrington, my intentions are not required to reassure you." The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret looked at her for a long moment, and Charlotte saw it again, that flicker behind the composed surface. The thing she had seen across the room at the gathering. Fear. Not of Charlotte precisely. Of the fact that she no longer had any power here. That the ledger of this particular relationship had shifted in a way that could not be shifted back. "The Charleston note," Margaret said abruptly. Charlotte went still. "You know about it," Margaret said, and it wasn't a question. "Yes. Nathaniel told me." She said it with a flatness that suggested the conversation had not been pleasant. "He told me last week, the full situation." She stopped. A pause that cost her something. "I was not aware of the extent of the obligations." Charlotte said nothing. "I want to know," Margaret said carefully, "whether you have any legal exposure to the property, as former wife." Charlotte studied her. This was the real reason for the visit. The vulnerability beneath the pride. "My legal claim to any Harrington property was settled in the divorce proceeding," Charlotte said. "I have no exposure to the property and no legal interest in it." Margaret exhaled, almost imperceptibly. "However," Charlotte continued, and Margaret went still again. "I have been informed by Samuel Carter's Richmond contacts that the note holder has been approached by a third party interested in acquiring the debt before September. If that happens, the terms become considerably less manageable than they currently are." The color drained from Margaret's face, slightly. Controlled, but real. "What third party?" she said. "I don't know yet. Samuel is looking into it." Charlotte paused. "It may be nothing. It may be significant. I thought you should know." Margaret stared at her. "Why?" she said. "Why would you tell me that?" Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "Because there are people in your household who have worked faithfully for years," she said. "And they deserve better than to lose their livelihood over a debt that had nothing to do with them." She held Margaret's gaze. "That is the only reason." The silence stretched. Margaret looked away first, toward the window. Her jaw was tight. "I treated you poorly," she said, and it came out like something being extracted under pressure, not an apology exactly, more like a fact she had finally stopped being able to deny. "I did not see you accurately." Charlotte looked at her. "No," she said. "You didn't." "I am not." Margaret stopped. "I don't ask your forgiveness. I don't imagine I've earned it." "No," Charlotte said again. "You haven't." Another silence. "But," Charlotte added, and Margaret looked back at her, "I am not your enemy. I have no interest in being your enemy. What I want is for you to understand that the woman you stood beside in that courtroom and on those steps was not what you said she was, and I believe you already understand that." Margaret's hands folded in her lap tightened briefly. "Yes," she said quietly. "I do." Charlotte stood. "I'll have Samuel keep me informed about the third-party situation," she said. "If there's something actionable, I'll let you know." Margaret rose as well, the old reflex, and for a moment they stood facing each other, two women with 6 years of complicated history between them, in a sitting room at the Fairfax Inn on a Wednesday morning. "Goodbye, Mrs. Harrington," Charlotte said. "Goodbye, Charlotte." She watched Margaret walk out. Then she stood alone in the sitting room for a long moment, listening to the sound of the carriage leaving, and felt something she hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not victory, something quieter. The specific particular feeling of a door finally completely closing. The third party turned out to be real. Samuel's Richmond contact identified them within a week, a land speculator named Holt Brevard out of Charleston, who had made a business of acquiring distressed debt in the years following difficult markets and then enforcing the terms with the precise legal ruthlessness of someone who had no interest in the human cost. He was not a villain exactly. He was simply a man who had identified a system and optimized himself for it. But the effect on the families who lost their properties to him was the same, regardless of his intentions. Charlotte met with Samuel on a Friday afternoon in the Carter offices and listened to the full picture. "He's offered to buy the note at a discount," Samuel said. "The original holder is inclined to accept simpler for them guaranteed return. If Brevard acquires it, he'll move on the collateral at the earliest legal opportunity." "The Richmond house," Charlotte said, "and everything in it. The sale would clear the debt, but leave the family with nothing." "And the household staff, the workers on the plantation." Samuel looked at her over his glasses. "New ownership, new terms. There are no guarantees." Charlotte was quiet. She thought about Lucy Garrett twisting her hat, usually on time. She thought about the 36 people who woke up in the Harrington household every morning and went about their work in the way that invisible people always did, dependably without fanfare, without anyone thinking too carefully about what their dependability cost them. She thought about what her father would have done. "I'm not interested in proving I'm stronger. I'm interested in building something worth more than the satisfaction." "What would it cost to buy the note ourselves?" she said. Samuel stared at her. "Charlotte, I'm not asking to save the Harrington family," she said flatly. "I'm asking what it would cost to control the terms of this situation, rather than leaving them to Brevard." Samuel looked at the papers in front of him. He was quiet for a moment, adding numbers in his head. "At the discount. Brevard is offering the current holder with our resources. It's manageable," he said carefully. "But Charlotte, if we acquire this note, and the Harrington family cannot pay, then we hold the collateral," she said. "Legally, fairly, with full transparency about the terms." She paused. "It would also give us first right of purchase on the Richmond house if it comes to that. That house sits on some of the best commercial real estate in this city." Samuel looked at her for a long moment. "You're not doing this for charity," he said. "No, I'm doing it because it's sound business and because it protects people who deserve to be protected. Both things can be true simultaneously." Samuel made a note. "I'll contact the current note holder," he said. "Do it today," Charlotte said. "Before Brevard." She told Nathaniel 2 days later. She sent word through proper channels, a note through Carter's offices asking for a meeting at the inn on Monday morning, formal and correct, and he arrived precisely on time, which she noticed. He came in looking like a man walking into a situation. He didn't fully understand but felt compelled toward anyway, which was honest enough to deserve credit. "Sit down, Nathaniel," Charlotte said. He sat. She told him. She was direct and complete, and she did not soften it unnecessarily. The note had been acquired by the Whitmore Trading Company. The terms were unchanged from the original. He had until September to satisfy the debt. If he could not, the collateral would be handled fairly and legally, and any staff of the household who were affected would be given 30 days' notice and a fair severance. Nathaniel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Why?" he said finally. "Because a man named Brevard was about to acquire it, and he is not known for fairness." "That's not entirely an answer. It's the relevant part of one." He looked at her. Really looked at her the way he hadn't since she couldn't remember when. Maybe the early years, maybe never fully. "I don't know how to accept help from you," he said. "I'm not sure I have the right to." "You're not accepting help," she said. "You're doing business with a company that acquired a debt you already owed. The terms are the same. My face on the other end of it is the only thing that changed." He flinched. "Still," he said. "Nathaniel." She leaned forward slightly. "I need you to hear me clearly. This is not about you and me. There is no you and me. What there is are the people in your household who come to work every day and deserve to be treated like the work they do has value. That is what I am protecting. Do you understand?" He met her eyes. "Yes," he said quietly. "I understand." "Good." She sat back. "Samuel Carter will provide you with the formal documentation by the end of the week. I'd recommend you speak with your own legal counsel before signing anything." He nodded. He rose to leave. At the door, he stopped. "Charlotte," he said. She looked up. "She's different," he said. "My mother, since the gathering, since your conversation at the inn, I don't know exactly what you said to her, but—" He stopped. "She asked about you, what your plans were. Not in the way she used to ask about people. She was—" He seemed to be searching for the word. "Genuine." Charlotte looked at him. "People can change," she said, "when the cost of staying the same becomes high enough." He nodded once. "Thank you," he said. "I know you don't need that from me. I'm saying it anyway." He left. July arrived, and with it the full weight of a Virginia summer, the kind that pressed down on everything and made the afternoons feel suspended and slow. Charlotte worked through it. She had been in Richmond long enough now that the Whitmore name had solidified into something real. Not just rumor, not just commercial society gossip, but a presence that the business community had begun to count on and factor into their calculations. 3 separate people approached her in July about investment partnerships. She said yes to one of them, a textile operation that aligned with her existing interests, and no to the other 2, with clear and specific reasoning that she provided directly rather than through intermediaries. She had found that being honest about the reasoning for a no was more valuable than the polite deflection most people expected. People remembered it. They came back. She was in the Carter offices on a Tuesday afternoon when the news arrived. The knock at the door was Samuel's clerk, younger man named Peters, who had an expressive face that he had never quite learned to manage. He came in with the look of someone carrying something hot. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "There's a gentleman here. He says he needs to speak with you personally. He won't give his name to me." Peters hesitated. "He says he knew your father." Charlotte looked up from the contract in front of her. "What does he look like?" she asked. Peters described him. 60, perhaps older. Well-dressed but not grandly. A quality about him that Peters struggled to articulate and finally described as, like someone who has been a great many places. Charlotte set down her pen. "Show him in," she said. The man who came through the door was not what she expected. He was tall, lean, with the weathered stillness of someone who had spent years outdoors making important decisions in conditions that did not allow for uncertainty. His hair was gray at the temples. He walked with authority, but without the performance of it, the specific, unself-conscious confidence of someone who had never needed to convince a room of anything. He stopped inside the door and looked at her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said, "You have his eyes, Arthur's eyes. Your mother's mouth, but Arthur's eyes." Charlotte rose from her chair slowly. "Who are you?" she said. "My name is James Whitmore," he said. "I'm your father's brother, your uncle, and I've been looking for you for 14 months. The room was very quiet. Charlotte stood perfectly still. "My father didn't have a brother," she said. "He did. He just never told anyone. We had a falling out many years ago when we were young and foolish and convinced that being right was worth more than being family." The man James didn't move from the doorway. "I heard about Arthur's death 8 years ago, secondhand the same way you probably did. By the time I tracked down Samuel Carter, the estate was in process. Carter's instructions were to wait for you to come forward before disclosing anything further." He paused. "He was waiting for you to find yourself first. I was apparently part of that waiting too." Charlotte looked at him. She thought about all the shapes that absence could take. Her father moving through harbor towns and trade routes, watching from a distance. Her mother carrying letters she didn't open. Samuel Carter, patient and deliberate, letting things unfold on Arthur Whitmore's timetable, even after Arthur was dead. A whole architecture of waiting built around her without her knowledge. "Why are you here now?" she said carefully. "Because Samuel wrote to me in April. He said you had taken control of the estate, handled the company, and handled it well. He said it was time." James finally moved, stepped fully into the room, stood at a respectful distance. "I'm not here to claim anything, Miss Whitmore, Charlotte. I'm not here to complicate your inheritance or your decisions. I have my own life, my own resources. I'm here because you're the last Whitmore, and I'm tired of being estranged from the last Whitmore." Charlotte studied him. His face, the way he stood, the particular quality of his stillness, which was, she realized with a start, that moved through her like cold water, familiar. Not from memory, from the mirror. "How long are you in Richmond?" she said finally. "As long as it takes," he said simply. "Have you eaten?" He blinked. "I know. I came directly from the inn." "Then sit down," she said, "and start from the beginning." James Whitmore stayed in Richmond for 3 weeks. They met every day, sometimes in the Carter offices, sometimes at Delia's, once on a long walk along the river that lasted 2 hours and covered 30 years of family history that Charlotte had never known existed. He told her about her father as a young man, reckless, brilliant, infuriating, incapable of staying in any place that didn't challenge him. He told her about the falling out between the brothers, which had been over a business decision, and then became about pride, and then became about silence, and then became about all the years the silence had lasted. He told her that he had tried twice to make contact with Arthur, and been rebuffed, and had eventually decided that Arthur would come to him when Arthur was ready, and Arthur had died before being ready. "The great tragedy of proud men," James said on the second day, "is that they are always certain they have more time." Charlotte thought about Nathaniel. She thought about her mother carrying a letter for 7 years before pressing it into Charlotte's hands on a wedding day. She thought about all the things people held on to too long, convinced there would be a better moment. "I won't make that mistake," she said. James looked at her. "No," he said. "I don't think you will." "John." He told her something else on the 3rd week that she had not expected. They were in the Carter offices going through a particular section of her father's old correspondence that she hadn't yet reviewed. Letters from the early years of the trading company when Arthur was still building. James had been helping her organize them, providing context she didn't have. He found a letter and went quiet. "What is it?" Charlotte said. He handed it to her without speaking. It was dated 18 years ago, written in her father's hand to Samuel Carter. "The Harrington family has approached me through intermediaries about a potential investment partnership," Arthur had written. "I decline. I have made inquiries about this family, and I do not find their character to be the kind I want the Whitmore name associated with. Margaret Harrington in particular operates on a system of values that I find fundamentally transactional. People to her are assets or liabilities, nothing more." Charlotte read it slowly. "I mention this in writing Because I understand my daughter has recently entered into courtship with the youngest Harrington son. I am aware this is not my business to interfere with, as I have made no effort to be present in her life. I say only this. Charlotte is better than any Harrington will ever deserve. I hope she knows that. I suspect she doesn't yet. I hope she learns it. Charlotte set the letter down on the desk. She read it twice more. Her father had known. Not just about the marriage, about the character of the family she was walking into. He had declined to do business with them. He had written it down clearly with the specific concern for her underneath it. And he had done nothing. He had watched and believed and waited for her to learn it herself. She sat with that for a long time. James watched her and did not speak. He was maddening, she said finally. Completely. James agreed. I was also right. She looked at the letter again. Charlotte is better than any Harrington will ever deserve. He saw it clearly. He just couldn't find a way to tell me that wouldn't have required him to be present. He was afraid, James said quietly, that you'd reject him, that he had forfeited the right to your attention. He was a man who had done everything well in business and everything badly in the parts of life that required staying still. Charlotte folded the letter carefully and placed it in the personal file she kept separate from the company documents. I would have listened, she said, if he had tried. I know, James said. I think he knew it too toward the end. I think that's why he left you everything, because it was the only language he was certain of. September arrived before Charlotte was ready for it. The note deadline, the date she had set in the back of her mind as the moment when everything that had been building would resolve one way or another. She was in Baltimore. When the message came, she had gone back for 10 days to handle the quarterly review with the ship captains and had stayed an extra day to work through a cargo dispute with a supplier in Norfolk. Samuel's letter reached her on a Thursday morning. Nathaniel Harrington has satisfied the note. Paid in full 3 days before deadline. Source of the funds a private sale of the Harrington property in the Western Territories. Apparently they had holdings there that Edwin never disclosed to the family. Nathaniel found them in the estate records. Charlotte read the letter standing at the window of her room at Mrs. Parrish's boarding house with the harbor spread out below her, and the sound of the ships, and the smell of salt, and the particular quality of September light that was already beginning to edge away from summer. She exhaled. She stood there for a moment feeling the shape of it. Nathaniel had found a way. Not through her. Not through anyone else's help. He had gone through his father's records, probably for the first time in his life, properly and thoroughly, and found a solution his father had never told him existed. He had done it himself. She thought unexpectedly that her father would have approved of that. She thought good for him. She meant it. She was back in Richmond by the following Monday. The city was moving into the particular rhythm of early fall. The summer heat easing, the social season beginning its second cycle. The commercial streets busy with the specific energy of people who had finished their summer obligations and were ready to get back to work. Charlotte was ready. She had a meeting that afternoon with 3 commercial society members about the harbor project. She had a dinner with Delia on Friday. She had a letter to write to James, who had returned to his home in Annapolis with a standing invitation to visit whenever he chose. She was walking to the Carter offices on a Tuesday morning when she heard her name called from across the street. She turned. It was Lucy Garrett, the young woman from the Harrington household, the one who had come to the inn with Nathaniel's message twisting her hat using the word usually. She was crossing the street toward Charlotte with a different quality than she'd had before. Not nervousness, something more deliberate. "Miss Whitmore," Lucy said when she reached her. "I heard you were back. I wanted to thank you for what you did with the note. The staff knows. Mr. Harrington told us directly." She paused. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Charlotte said. "You made a promise," Lucy said. "I didn't. When you said it, I didn't fully believe it. I've had promises made before." She looked at Charlotte steadily. "But you kept it." Charlotte looked at her. "Miss Garrett," she said, "what were you doing before you came to work at the Harrington house?" Lucy looked surprised. "I was nothing, ma'am. I helped my mother at home. There wasn't much." "Can you read right?" "I can read. I can write reasonably well. A flicker of uncertainty. Why? Because I am opening an office here in Richmond for the Whitmore Trading Company, and I need a clerk who pays attention and keeps their word. She watched Lucy's face. I'd be looking for someone to start in October. The wages would be better than the Harrington household. The work would be more demanding. Lucy Garrett stared at her. You're serious, she said. I am always serious when I offer someone work, Charlotte said. Think about it. Have Samuel Carter know your answer by Friday. She walked on. Behind her she heard Lucy Garrett say something she couldn't fully make out, something between a word and a sound, and she felt without turning around that it was the sound of someone who had just been offered a door they had never expected to be on the right side of. She knew that sound. She had made it herself once in a law office in Baltimore, reading her father's letter for the first time. She kept walking. The Carter offices were 2 blocks away. The Harbor Project meeting was at 2 o'clock. The September sun was warm on her shoulders, and the Richmond street was busy and loud and alive around her. And Charlotte Whitmore was for perhaps the first time in her life, and certainly for the first time in years, exactly where she was supposed to be doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing. She didn't slow down. She had work to do. Lucy Garrett showed up at the Carter offices on Thursday, not Friday. Thursday, 1 day early, and she came in the morning before the clerks had finished opening the post with her hair neatly pinned and her hands still, for the first time since Charlotte had met her. She asked for Samuel Carter and told him she had an answer for Miss Whitmore. Samuel sent word to Charlotte at the inn. Charlotte smiled when she read it. She had hoped for Friday and gotten Thursday. That told her everything she needed to know about Lucy Garrett. She sent back one line. Tell her she starts October 1st. Have the paperwork drawn up today. October 1st was 3 weeks away. Charlotte used all 3 of them. She had been building toward the Richmond office for months since Baltimore, really since the first time she'd understood that the Whitmore Trading Company's reach extended far enough into Virginia commerce that managing it from 200 miles away was a structural inefficiency she could not sustain indefinitely. The decision to plant herself permanently in Richmond had not been about the Harrington family or the gathering or any of the personal history she had walked back into. It had been a business decision. Everything else had been additional. She told herself that. She mostly believed it. The office space she had secured was on Main Street, 3 buildings down from the Carter and Associates office, which was deliberate. She wanted proximity to Samuel's legal resources without dependence on them. The rooms were plain and functional, and she furnished them herself over 2 afternoons, choosing what she needed and nothing she didn't. A large desk. Good chairs. Proper shelving for ledgers. A table large enough for contract review with multiple parties. On the last afternoon before Lucy arrived, Charlotte stood in the empty office alone and looked at it. She thought about all the rooms she had worked in that hadn't been hers. The Harrington household accounts managed in a corner of Nathaniel's study. The Baltimore boarding house desk letters and ledgers, crowding out the small surface until she'd had to stack things on the floor. Samuel's office generous with its space, but always borrowed. This room was hers. She had paid for it. She had chosen it. She ran her hand along the top of the large desk and felt the grain of the wood under her palm and thought very simply, Father, I hope you're watching. Lucy arrived at 8 o'clock on a Monday morning in a clean dress with ink already on her right hand from practicing her ledger entries the night before, and Charlotte looked at that ink stain and felt something warm settle in her chest. Sit down, Charlotte said. We have a great deal to go through. They spent the first week establishing systems. Charlotte was a rigorous teacher, not harsh, but exacting with the specific patience of someone who had learned by doing and understood exactly where the gaps were. She walked Lucy through the filing structure, the contract language, the way the shipping schedules mapped against the accounts. The difference between a working number and a committed number and why confusing them was the kind of error that compounded. Lucy made mistakes. She admitted them immediately without defensiveness, and she did not make the same one twice. By the end of the first week, Charlotte trusted her with the preliminary post. By the end of the second, she had given her responsibility for the daily ledger entries. By the end of the month, she was leaving Lucy alone in the office for hours at a time, and returning to find everything exactly as it should be. One afternoon, she came back from a meeting to find Lucy in quiet conversation with one of the ship captains, Josiah Hale, who had come down from Baltimore for a cargo review, and Lucy was asking him questions about the Charleston route with the specific alert interest of someone who was trying to understand how a system worked, not just record its numbers. Hale caught Charlotte's eye over Lucy's head. He gave her the same slow nod he'd given her on the Baltimore docks almost a year ago. Charlotte went into her office and sat down and permitted herself to feel genuinely pleased for exactly 2 minutes. Then she picked up the contract in front of her and got back to work. The first real crisis came on a Wednesday in late October. Charlotte was reviewing the quarterly numbers when Samuel appeared at her office door without his usual knock, which meant something was wrong, and came in and closed the door behind him. "Brevard," he said. She looked up. "Holt Brevard," Samuel said. "The speculator. He's in Richmond." Charlotte set down her pen. "The note was settled," she said. "He lost the opportunity. He's not pursuing the note." Samuel pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. "He's pursuing something else. He's been making inquiries about the Whitmore Trading Company. About you specifically. About the legitimacy of the inheritance claim." The room went very quiet. "On what grounds?" Charlotte said. "He's suggesting through intermediaries, nothing public yet, that Arthur Whitmore's estate was not properly handled. That there are questions about whether the trust was legally established before his death. That the transfer of assets to you may be contestable." Charlotte stared at him. "Is there any validity to that?" she said. "None that I can see," Samuel said. "I drew up Arthur's documents myself, but legal challenges don't require validity to be damaging. They require money and time and the willingness to make a public dispute." He paused. "Brevard has all three." "Why?" Charlotte said. "He lost the Harrington note. Why come after us?" Samuel looked at her steadily. "Because you cost him something he expected to have. Men like Brevard don't forget that. And because—" He stopped. "Say it, Samuel." "Because you're a woman," he said quietly. "And he believes a contested legal claim against a woman without a husband's name behind her is easier to pursue and easier to win than the same claim against a man." Charlotte sat with that for a moment. She felt the anger come up clean and cold and clarifying. Not the hot, blind anger of the courthouse, but something sharper. The anger of someone who has built something real and watched someone else decide it should be easier to take because of who built it. She let herself feel it. Then she used it. "Get me every document related to the estate establishment," she said. "Every letter, every legal filing, every piece of correspondence between you and my father from the last 5 years of his life." She picked up her pen. "And get me the name of the best property and estate attorney in Virginia, who is not already connected to either the Harrington family or the Carter firm." "There's a woman," Samuel started. Charlotte looked up. Samuel had the expression of a man who had surprised himself. "A solicitor. She operates through her husband's practice formally, but she's the one doing the work. Her name is Eleanor Marsh, no relation to Delia. She's formidable." "Get her in here by Friday," Charlotte said. "Charlotte, Friday, Samuel." He left. She sat for a moment after the door closed alone in her office on Main Street, with the Richmond afternoon going on outside the window, and her whole carefully constructed year sitting in the room with her like something fragile she hadn't realized was fragile. Then she straightened her back. She picked up the quarterly numbers she'd been reviewing. She went back to work. Eleanor Marsh arrived on Friday. She was 40 precise, with a quality of attention that Charlotte recognized immediately because she had been cultivating it in herself all year. The complete focused intelligence of someone who never assumes she knows what she's looking at until she has looked at it fully. She read every document Charlotte gave her. She read them in the office at the large table in silence for 2 hours. Charlotte worked at her own desk and did not interrupt. When Eleanor finished, she set the papers down and looked at Charlotte directly. "He has nothing," she said. Charlotte exhaled. "But," Eleanor continued, "nothing can become something if he's willing to spend money making it look like something in front of the right judge." This is how men like Brevard operate. They don't need to win. They need to create enough uncertainty that the other party, she paused, settles. Gives up a portion of what they have to make the noise stop. I won't settle, Charlotte said. I assumed not. Then we prepare to fight. Eleanor began sorting the documents into a different order, her own order. A logic Charlotte couldn't quite follow yet. I'll need 3 weeks to build the counter-argument properly. In the meantime, I'd recommend we make a preemptive filing that establishes the legitimacy of the trust publicly and on record before he can file anything. It changes the landscape. Do it, Charlotte said. It will cost. Do it. Eleanor looked at her for a moment with the specific expression of a woman who was revising her understanding of another woman upward. Very well, she said. The filing went in on a Tuesday. By Thursday, word had reached Brevard. By Friday, something unexpected happened. Charlotte was in the middle of a meeting with the Commercial Society. The harbor project had progressed enough that they were now discussing actual construction timelines, when a note was brought in and set discreetly beside her on the table. She read it without breaking her participation in the conversation. It was from Samuel. Brevard has withdrawn. No explanation given. His Richmond contact has left the city. I believe he was more reliant on the element of surprise than I initially assessed. Worth monitoring, but I believe the immediate threat has passed. Charlotte folded the note. She returned her full attention to the harbor project meeting. She did not let a single thing show on her face. Later after the meeting, after she had walked back to the office and told Lucy, and watched Lucy's carefully controlled reaction break into something that looked very close to relief after she had sent a brief note to Eleanor Marsh and a longer one to Samuel. She sat alone and allowed herself to feel how frightened she had been. Not of losing. She was not afraid of losing. She had already lost things. She knew what that felt like, and she had survived it. She had been afraid of what it would mean if someone could simply decide to come after everything she had built. Everything she had worked for, everything her father had believed she could do, and undo it on a technicality. On the legal vulnerability of being a woman who did not have a man's name in front of hers. She sat with that fear. She named it. Then she picked up her pen and added a line to the letter she was writing to James in Annapolis. There is a gap in the law, she wrote, and I intend to spend a portion of my father's legacy working to close it. More on this soon. She sealed the letter and handed it to Lucy to post. Then she opened the next contract on her desk and kept going. November arrived with the first real cold of the season. Richmond tightened into its autumn rhythms. Fires in the grates, heavier coats, the particular quality of the air that came off the James River in the mornings. Charlotte barely noticed the weather. She was inside the work. The harbor project had entered a phase that required her direct involvement in weekly meetings. The Baltimore operation needed her for 2 days in mid-November for the annual captain review. And the Richmond office was growing not dramatically, but steadily in the way that solid things grew. She hired a second clerk in November, a young man named Robert who had been recommended by Judge Alderton and who turned out to have a natural aptitude for the numerical side of the work that complemented Lucy's strengths in organization and correspondence. She paid them both well. She told them why. The work you do matters, she said on the afternoon she brought Robert on with both of them sitting across from her at the big table. Not just to this company. The way a business treats the people who make it run is a statement about what the business believes. I believe the people who do the work deserve to be compensated for the work they do. She looked at them steadily. I expect a great deal from you. In return, I will give you what I say I'll give you when I say I'll give it without excuse. That's the arrangement. Lucy and Robert exchanged a glance. Yes, ma'am, Lucy said. Good, Charlotte said. Now, the Charleston route numbers are off by 4%. Let's find out why. It was Delia who brought her the news about Margaret. They were at Delia's house on a Tuesday in late November. The regular lunch, the reliable rhythm, and Delia set down her fork with the particular deliberateness Charlotte had learned to recognize as a signal. Margaret Harrington is unwell, Delia said. Charlotte looked up. What kind of unwell? Her heart. She collapsed at home 3 weeks ago. Nathaniel has kept it quiet. You know how the family is about these things, but it's serious. She's been confined to the house. Delia paused. She asked about you. Charlotte went still. She asked Nathaniel, Delia said carefully. Whether you knew, whether you would. She apparently stopped herself before finishing the sentence. Nathaniel wasn't sure what she was going to ask. Charlotte was quiet for a long moment. She thought about Margaret in the courthouse, on the courthouse steps, in the sitting room at the Fairfax Inn, the composure that had cracked just slightly across a crowded room. She thought about what Margaret had said that morning at the inn. I don't ask your forgiveness. I don't imagine I've earned it. She thought about what she had said back. You haven't. She picked up her teacup, set it down. I'll call on her, she said. Delia looked at her steadily. You don't have to. I know. Charlotte folded her napkin. I want to. She went the following afternoon. Nathaniel answered the door himself, which surprised her, and which told her more than any report could have. How much had changed in the Harrington household in the past months. The man who had once had a staff of 8, managing every threshold of his life, was answering his own front door. He looked at her for a moment. She's in the parlor, he said. She knows you're coming. He stopped. Thank you for coming. How is she? Charlotte asked directly. Smaller, he said, and the word came out with a grief that he didn't try to manage, which was the most honest she had ever seen him. The parlor was warm and quiet. Margaret was in a chair by the fire. Not her usual commanding posture, but something reduced the way a person becomes when their body has reminded them forcefully of what they are. She was still dressed well. She would always dress well. But she looked, as Nathaniel had said, smaller, as though the architecture of her certainty had taken some structural damage and everything built on top of it had settled. She looked up when Charlotte came in. Charlotte sat down across from her without waiting to be invited. I heard you were unwell, Charlotte said. I have been. Margaret's voice was steady. That at least had not changed. I am improving. I'm glad. A silence. It was not uncomfortable exactly, but it was full of everything that had been said and not said between them over 7 years, all of it present in the room. I want to ask you something, Margaret said. And I want you to be honest with me. Not kind, honest. Charlotte nodded. Did I ruin him? Margaret said. Nathaniel. By the way, She stopped. Her jaw tightened. By what I required of him. Charlotte looked at her. She took her time before answering because the question deserved real consideration, and Margaret had asked for honesty. You made him weak in some ways, Charlotte said carefully. You made his confidence dependent on your approval instead of his own judgment. That hurt him. She paused. But he's not ruined. He found those landholdings himself. He settled that note without help. He answered his own door today. She held Margaret's gaze. He's finding out who he is without you standing in front of him. That's uncomfortable work, but he's doing it. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. He's better than I gave him room to be, she said quietly. Yes, Charlotte said. He is. Another silence. And I am worse, Margaret said, than I believed myself to be. Charlotte did not contradict her. I think, she said carefully, that you believed what you were taught to believe, and you taught it to others because it was all you had. That doesn't excuse it, but it explains something. Margaret looked at the fire. I have spent 60 years believing that position was protection, she said. That if you held the right name, the right house, the right associations, nothing could touch you. She was quiet. I was wrong, in the most fundamental way, and it took losing. She stopped. It took this, to understand it. Charlotte watched her. Mrs. Harrington, she said, and Margaret looked at her. I don't need your apology. I told you that at the inn, and I meant it. What you did to me in that marriage and in that courtroom was real, and the damage was real, and an apology can't undo it. She leaned forward slightly. But I want you to understand something. I am not sitting in this chair because I wanted to see you brought low. I am sitting here because you asked about me, And because whatever we were to each other, there was 7 years of it. That has weight, and I am not the kind of person who pretends it doesn't. Margaret's eyes were very bright. She did not cry. Charlotte had not expected her to. "You are remarkably like your father," Margaret said finally. "I knew Arthur Whitmore by reputation. I declined to do business with him years ago. He had the same quality you have, the ability to be in a room with someone who has wronged them and remain intact." Charlotte looked at her. "I know," she said. "He wrote about you." Margaret blinked. "He found your character unsuited to his business values," Charlotte said. "Those were his words. He was not wrong." Something moved across Margaret's face. Not offense, something more complicated. "No," she said. "He was not wrong." Charlotte rose. "Get better, Mrs. Harrington," she said. "For Nathaniel's sake. He needs you present." "Present?" Margaret repeated, as though the word meant something specific to her. "Yes." Charlotte left. She walked out through the Harrington front door into the November afternoon and stood for a moment on the steps. The same steps where Margaret had handed her a bag that weighed nothing. She stood on them now without that weight. She walked down them and kept going. December came in cold and clear. Charlotte was in Baltimore for the last week of the year finalizing the annual accounts with Samuel and the captains when a letter arrived from James in Annapolis. He had been thinking about her note. He wrote about the gap in the law, about the vulnerability she had identified, the particular legal exposure that women of property faced without a husband's name to anchor their claims. I had contacts in the state legislature, he said. Men who owed him favors. Men who might listen. "I'm not promising anything," he wrote, "but I'm willing to start a conversation if you are. I think our father would have wanted us to use what we have for something larger than ourselves. This seems like the something." Charlotte read the letter twice. She thought about Eleanor Marsh doing real legal work under her husband's name. She thought about Lucy Garrett, whose intelligence had been sitting in a Harrington household, going underused because there had been nowhere for it to go. She thought about her mother carrying a letter for 7 years because she didn't know what her husband had left, or whether it was real, or what to do with it. She thought about all the women in all the rooms doing the invisible work, holding the invisible weight, being told they were insufficient by systems that had never been designed with their sufficiency in mind. She picked up her pen. Yes, she wrote to James. Start the conversation. She was back in Richmond for Christmas. She spent the holiday with Delia, a small gathering, 8 people, nothing grand. Comfortable and warm and loud in the way that gatherings were when the people in them had chosen each other honestly. Lucy was there. Robert was there with his younger sister, who was 14, and looked at Charlotte with the specific wide attention of someone encountering an idea for the first time. James came down from Annapolis for 3 days and sat across the table from Delia and managed to charm her completely within 40 minutes, which Charlotte privately considered something of an achievement. After dinner, when the others had moved to the parlor, Charlotte and James sat at the cleared table with 2 glasses of wine and the quiet that settles between people who have decided to be family. "Tell me about my father," she said. "Not the business, the person." James was quiet for a moment. He laughed loudly, he said. At the wrong moments, things that weren't meant to be funny. He couldn't sit through a meal without getting up at least once. He remembered numbers perfectly and forgot faces constantly. He paused. "He talked about you. More than he probably knew he was talking about you. I visited him once about 4 years before he died in Baltimore. We had a long night, a lot of wine, and somewhere in the middle of it, he said without any context, 'My daughter is going to do something important. I don't know what. But I know it as well as I know anything.'" Charlotte looked at her wine glass. "What did you say?" she asked. "I asked him why he didn't tell her that. And he said he didn't know how to show up in the right size." James looked at her. "He said every time he imagined being in the room with you, he felt like he would take up the wrong amount of space. Too much or not enough." Charlotte sat with that. "He was afraid," she said. "Completely." "Then he was a fool," she said. "And I loved him anyway." She said it without having planned to. The words came out simply the way true things do when you stop managing them, and she felt them land in the room and stay there. James looked at her for a long moment. "Good," he said quietly. I think he needed someone to say that. January arrived. The new year sat over Richmond like a clean page full of the specific potential of something that hadn't been written yet. Charlotte was in her office on the second morning of the year when a knock came at the door. Not Lucy, she recognized Lucy's knock. This was someone else. "Come in," she said. The door opened. It was Nathaniel. He stood in the doorway of her office on Main Street. Her office, her name on the door, her ledgers on her shelves, and he had the expression of a man who had rehearsed this moment and was now discovering that rehearsal is not the same thing as the moment. "I'm sorry to come without arranging it properly," he said. "What do you need, Nathaniel?" He came in and closed the door and stood in the middle of the room, not sitting, holding his hat in his hands, the way Lucy had once twisted hers. The gesture made him look suddenly much younger. "I wanted to tell you something," he said, "before too much time passes and I talk myself out of it." Charlotte set her pen down. "My mother is improving," he said. She's different. I don't know exactly what you said to her, but she is different. She asked me last week to stop managing her correspondence. She said she would do it herself." He paused. "She's been writing letters. I don't know to whom. She won't tell me, but she's writing them." Charlotte thought about that. "I'm glad," she said. "I also wanted to say—" He stopped, started again. "I know that what I'm about to say is too small for what I did. I know that. But I want to say it anyway because I have been not saying it for too long, and the not saying has become its own kind of damage." He met her eyes. "I am sorry, Charlotte. For the courthouse. For the things I said. For the years I spent letting my mother's voice become my own, in ways that cost you things you deserved to have." The room was very quiet. Charlotte looked at him for a long time. She thought about the woman on the courthouse steps, about the bag, about the letter she hadn't opened. She thought about Baltimore and the docks and the ledgers, and Captain Hale's nod and Samuel's voice saying, "Your father always said," and Lucy's ink-stained hands, and James laughing across a dinner table. She thought about everything it had taken to become who she now was, and she understood with a clarity that was not bitter and not triumphant, but simply clear that every single piece of it had been necessary. The loss and the leaving and the long winter of becoming. "Thank you," she said, "for saying it." He nodded. He turned the hat in his hands once. "Is there anything?" he started. "No," she said, not harshly. "There's nothing you owe me, Nathaniel. The apology is enough. What you owe is to be better than you were, to the people around you, to yourself." She looked at him steadily. "You're already starting. Keep going." He stood there for a moment longer. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He left. Charlotte sat alone in her office for a moment. She looked at the shelves, the ledgers. Her name on the papers spread across the desk. She thought about her father's words. She was valuable before anyone recognized it. She had been. She had always been. And now, finally, completely without apology or condition, the world was beginning to recognize it too. She picked up her pen. She had work to do. James's letter arrived on a Thursday in February, and Charlotte read it standing up, because she had been on her way out the door when Lucy handed it to her, and once she started reading, she forgot entirely that she had been going anywhere. The legislature contact had agreed to a meeting. Not a formal session, not a public hearing. A private meeting in Annapolis with 3 men who sat on the committee that reviewed property law. Men who had enough political caution to want to understand what they were being asked before they committed to anything, and enough genuine interest, James believed, to actually listen. "I want you there," James had written. "Not me speaking for you. You speaking for yourself. These men need to hear your voice, not a summary of it." Charlotte folded the letter. She stood in the doorway of the Whitmore office on Main Street, with the February cold coming in off the street, and Richmond moving around her in its ordinary morning way. And she felt the specific feeling she had learned to recognize over the past year, the feeling of a door opening that she had not known was there until she was standing in front of it. She turned back inside. "Lucy," she said, "clear my calendar for the week of the 20th. I'm going to Annapolis." Lucy looked up from the ledger. "All of it. All of it." Lucy made a note without asking further questions. This was one of the things Charlotte valued most about her. She spent the 2 weeks before Annapolis preparing the way. She prepared for everything now, completely methodically, with the understanding that walking into any room half-ready was a form of disrespect to yourself and everyone in that room. She worked with Eleanor Marsh on the legal framing. Eleanor was direct and efficient, and had the particular gift of translating the emotional reality of injustice into the precise legal language that men in committee rooms could engage with without feeling accused. They sat together at the big table in the Whitmore office for 3 long evenings, building the argument piece by piece. "The core of it," Eleanor said on the second evening, "is that the current system creates legal ambiguity around property held by women that doesn't exist for men. That ambiguity is exploitable. We've seen it exploited." She looked at Charlotte. "Brevard tried it on you. He will try it on someone else. Someone who doesn't have Samuel Carter behind her and the resources to fight." "That's the argument," Charlotte said. "Not sentiment. Legal efficiency. Closing a gap that costs the system credibility." "Exactly." Eleanor paused. "Men in committee rooms respond better to the language of systems than the language of fairness. Fairness sounds like a demand. Efficiency sounds like a solution." Charlotte looked at her steadily. "Does it bother you framing it that way?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "I've been doing real legal work for 15 years under my husband's name," she said. "What bothers me is the gap, not the language we use to close it." She picked up her pen. "Let's get back to work." The morning Charlotte left for Annapolis, she found a note on her desk from Lucy. It was short and written in Lucy's increasingly confident hand. "Miss Whitmore, the quarterly numbers are in the ledger and the Charleston contracts are filed. Robert and I will manage. Go do the important thing. We'll be here when you come back." Charlotte folded the note and put it in her coat pocket. She carried it all the way to Annapolis. The meeting with James's contacts was on a Tuesday afternoon in a private room at the State House. 3 men, mid-50s all of them, the kind of faces that had learned to reveal nothing while assessing everything. They shook her hand when James introduced her, some of them with more ease than others, and they sat down, and they waited to hear what she had to say. She told them. She was direct, and she was specific, and she was not emotional. Not because she didn't feel it, but because Eleanor had been right. This was not the room for feeling. This was the room for argument, and she had the argument. She told them about the legal vulnerability, about the way ambiguity in property law created exploitable gaps, about Brevard not by name, but as a type, because there were more Brevards, and they all understood it. About the cost to the system when legitimate property claims could be destabilized by bad faith challenges. She told them what she was asking for. Not everything, not a revolution. A specific, narrow clarification to the existing property trust language that would close the gap Eleanor had identified. She put the document Eleanor had prepared on the table. Then she stopped talking and let them read it. The room was very quiet while they read. One of the men, older, with a quality of stillness that Charlotte associated with people who made important decisions regularly, set the document down and looked at her. "You were involved in the Whitmore estate case," he said. Not a question. "I am the Whitmore estate," she said. "The Brevard challenge." "Yes." He looked at the document again. "This is narrower than I expected," he said. "Most petitions of this kind want more." "I'm not asking for more," Charlotte said. "I'm asking for this, specifically, because this is what the law needs. We can discuss more later when this is done." The man looked at James, then back at Charlotte. "Leave the document," he said. "We'll review it with counsel." "Of course," Charlotte said. She rose. She shook their hands again. She and James walked out of the State House into the February afternoon, and James waited until they were half a block away before he said anything. "You were extraordinary," he said. "They haven't decided anything yet." "No, but they will." He looked at her with the expression she had come to associate with him, that particular mix of pride and something almost like grief. The feeling of a man who wished he had known her longer. Your father would have been... I know, she said. She kept walking. The response came in 3 weeks. Not a yes. Not yet. But a request for a follow-up meeting with 2 additional committee members and a note from James's contact that used the word promising in a sentence that contained no qualifications. Charlotte read the note and went to find Eleanor. Eleanor read it, set it on the desk, and said, 2 more meetings, maybe 3, then a vote. How long? 6 months, if we're fortunate. Charlotte nodded. Then we have 6 months to make the argument better than it already is, she said. Eleanor looked at her for a moment. I want to be in those rooms, Eleanor said. The follow-up meetings, with you. Charlotte looked at her steadily. Then you will be. Eleanor exhaled a long, controlled breath that Charlotte recognized as the sound of someone who had spent years not asking for things finally asking. Thank you, Eleanor said. Don't thank me, Charlotte said. Come prepared. Tahe. Spring came back to Richmond the way it always did. Suddenly, then completely, the dogwoods and the azaleas making their insistent annual argument that beauty was not optional. Charlotte barely noticed. She was in the middle of the most demanding period of work she had yet undertaken. The harbor project had moved into its construction phase, which meant oversight meetings twice a week and a set of contractor negotiations that required her direct involvement, because the numbers kept shifting in ways that needed someone who understood the full picture. The Baltimore operation needed a new captain. Josiah Hale had decided to retire, which he announced on a gray March morning with the gruff dignity of a man who had given 30 years to the sea and felt he had paid his dues, and replacing someone of his caliber was not a simple matter. She promoted from within. The second captain, a man named Davies, who had sailed under Hale for 8 years and had the same quality of steady competence Charlotte had come to trust, came into her office in Baltimore, looking like he was expecting to be told something bad. You're the senior captain now, Charlotte told him. Same salary structure as Hale, reviewed quarterly. I need your first report on the spring routes by April 15th. Davies stared at her. I thought you were bringing someone from outside, he said. I considered it. Charlotte looked at him steadily. Then I looked at the numbers from your runs over the past 3 years and stopped considering it. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, ma'am, he said. He left looking like a man who had walked in expecting a storm and walked out into clear weather, still slightly disoriented by the change. Charlotte smiled. Then she went back to the contracts. The twist came in April, and it came from a direction she had not anticipated. She was at the Whitmore office on a Wednesday afternoon when Lucy appeared at her door with an expression that Charlotte had learned to read, precisely the specific look of someone who has received information they don't know how to carry. There's a woman here, Lucy said. She won't give me her name. She says she knows you. A pause. She says she's your mother's sister. Charlotte set her pen down very slowly. My mother had no siblings, she said. That's what I thought you'd say. Lucy's voice was careful. She's been waiting for 20 minutes. She's old, Miss Whitmore. She looks... I don't know how to describe it. She looks like someone who has been holding something for a very long time. Charlotte was quiet for a moment. Show her in, she said. The woman who came through the door was perhaps 70 small, with the kind of face that had once been beautiful and was now something better than beautiful. It was honest. Every year was in it. Every decision. She wore plain clothes, good quality, but not grand. And she moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who had thought very hard about whether to be here and had decided finally that the cost of not coming was higher than the cost of coming. She stopped inside the door and looked at Charlotte. And Charlotte felt something she had not expected: recognition. Not of a face she had seen before, but of something behind the face, a quality, a way of holding still, her mother's way. Sit down, Charlotte said quietly. The woman sat. My name is Frances Alderton, the woman said. Before I married, my name was Frances Whitmore. She stopped. Not your father's family, your mother's family. She folded her hands in her lap. Your mother and I were sisters. We were estranged for most of your life. It was my fault. A disagreement when we were young that I let harden into something permanent because I was too proud to undo it." Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was costing her something. "She died without us reconciling. I have not forgiven myself for that." Charlotte looked at her. "Why are you here now?" she said. "Because I heard about you." Frances met her eyes directly. "I heard about the courtroom last year, and the Baltimore company, and the work you've been doing in Richmond. I heard your name, and I thought your mother's name." She stopped. "I thought about all the years, and I decided I was too old to be too proud anymore." The room was very quiet. Charlotte thought about her mother, about the letter pressed into her hands on a wedding day, about 3 days of crying for a man who had never been present enough to lose, about all the invisible labor of a woman who had raised a daughter alone and done it with more grace than the circumstances deserved. She thought about James, about the estrangement between brothers that had lasted decades and ended with a man full of stories he'd had no one to tell. She thought about what she had told Nathaniel. People can change when the cost of staying the same becomes high enough. "How long are you in Richmond?" Charlotte asked. Frances blinked. I took a room at the inn. For a week. In case—" She stopped. "I didn't know if you would see me." "I'm seeing you," Charlotte said. "Yes. Then come to dinner on Friday." Charlotte looked at her steadily. "James Whitmore will be here, my father's brother. You should meet him, and we'll talk. About my mother. About everything she was that I didn't have enough time to learn." Frances Alderton sat very still for a moment. Then something broke across her face quietly, completely, and Charlotte understood she was witnessing a woman being released from something she had been carrying for a very long time. "Yes," Frances said. "I would like that very much." Dinner on Friday was loud and warm, and went 3 hours longer than Charlotte had planned. Frances and James were strangers who discovered within 40 minutes that they had been shaped by the same losses from different angles. Both of them people who had let pride cost them decades of family, and they recognized each other with the particular recognition of people who understand the same regret. Delia was there. Lucy was there. Eleanor came with her husband, who turned out to be a quiet and genuinely kind man, who had spent 15 years running interference for his wife's career with a matter-of-fact dedication that Charlotte found she respected enormously. At some point in the third hour, with the candles burning low and the wine gone and everyone talking across each other in the easy way of people who had stopped managing the impression they made, Charlotte looked around the table and felt something settle in her chest. This was the thing her father had not known how to build. Not the company, not the ships or the warehouses or the trade routes. This, a table of people who had chosen each other, who had been found or had found her through the specific series of losses and decisions and refusals to stay diminished that had brought her to this room. She thought about the courthouse, the faded blue dress, the bag that weighed nothing. She thought about the bench under the oak tree where she had sat and read her father's letter with the Richmond summer pressing down on everything, and the world moving around her as though nothing had changed. Everything had changed. Everything had changed because she had refused to let the world's verdict about her become her own. Frances caught her eye from across the table and smiled a smile that carried her mother in it, just slightly, just enough, and Charlotte smiled back. The legislative vote came in August. 6 months, Eleanor had said. 6 months almost to the day. Charlotte and Eleanor were both in Annapolis for it. Not in the chamber. Women did not sit in the chamber, but in a room adjacent where James was, where a young clerk who owed James a favor would come with word the moment the vote concluded. They waited for 2 hours. Eleanor sat straight and still and said almost nothing, which was how Charlotte had learned Eleanor handled tension. Charlotte paced. She did not pace far, 4 steps, one direction, 4 steps back, but she paced, which Eleanor observed with the expression of someone filing information away. "Your father," Eleanor said at the 90-minute mark. Charlotte stopped pacing. "What about him?" "You said once that he stepped off the cliff and flew." Eleanor looked at her steadily. "You've been stepping off cliffs all year. I thought you should know that someone has noticed. Charlotte looked at her. I noticed, she said, that you've been doing real legal work for 15 years, and now you're in a room waiting to hear whether a law that should have existed already is finally going to exist. I thought you should know that someone has noticed that too. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Fair, she said. The door opened. The clerk, young flushed, trying very hard to maintain the expression of professional neutrality, and failing at it completely, came in and looked at them. He nodded. Once. Charlotte stood completely still. Eleanor closed her eyes for 3 seconds. Then she opened them and said, Right, what's next? Charlotte laughed. It came out surprised and real, the kind of laugh that is not about amusement, but about something releasing that has been held very tightly for a long time. The follow-up legislation, she said. We agreed. This was the first step. 6 months, Eleanor said. Or less. Now that they know we're serious. Eleanor gathered her papers from the table with brisk, precise movements. I'll have the first draft to you by October, she said. September, Charlotte said. Eleanor looked at her. September, Eleanor agreed. She went to her father's grave for the first time in October. It was a churchyard outside Baltimore, simple and well-kept, a stone with his name and the dates and nothing else. She had known about it for over a year, but had not gone. She had not been ready, or she had told herself she was not ready, which she understood now were not always the same thing. James came with her. They stood at the grave in the October morning, the two of them, and it was quiet in the way that graveyards in October are always quiet. Not oppressively, but completely, as though the world had agreed to give this place a different quality of time. Charlotte looked at the stone for a long while. She thought about everything she had wanted to say to him. The anger she had carried for years at the absence, the distance, the philosophy of preparation that had required her suffering as part of its design. She had thought in darker moments in Baltimore that she would stand at this grave someday and feel that anger fully and let it out. She didn't feel anger. She felt something older and softer than anger. She felt the specific grief of loving someone you never fully had, and the specific gratitude of having been loved back in the language they knew, which was not the right language, which was insufficient, but which was real. I built it, she said aloud. Her voice came out steady and quiet. I did what you thought I could do. And then I did more than that, because it turns out you underestimated some things. She paused. I found James. I found Francis. I found people. She looked at the stone. You should have been there to meet them. That's the part I'm still angry about. Not the waiting, not the conditions. That you didn't get to see it. James put his hand on her shoulder briefly. She let it stay there for a moment. He saw it, James said quietly. I believe that. Wherever that kind of seeing happens from, he saw it. Charlotte nodded. She reached into her coat pocket. She took out the miniature portrait herself and Nathaniel Year One that she had carried in the drawer of that desk through Baltimore and Richmond and all the months between. She had not thrown it away. She had not been ready to, and then she had not needed to, because she had understood eventually that it was not the portrait of a mistake. It was the portrait of the beginning of the longest and most necessary journey of her life. She set it against the base of the stone. She stepped back. She looked at her father's name one last time. Thank you, she said, for believing before I could. I'll take it from here. She turned. She and James walked out of the churchyard together into the October morning, and the world was waiting: the harbor, the ships, the offices on Main Street, the follow-up legislation, the next contract, the next decision, the next woman who needed a door opened that should have been open all along. And Charlotte Whitmore walked toward all of it without slowing down, without looking back, without any uncertainty about who she was or what she was worth. She had known it once before the world had told her otherwise. She had found her way back, and she was never going to lose it again.